The authors of the Christian scriptures relied heavily on prior Jewish literature for the basis of their writings. Stories concerning Jesus and the prominent figures of early Christianity were often inspired by or based on scenes from the Old Testament and apocryphal Jewish works. From the idea that the Messiah would rule over all the nations of the world in Psalm 2, or that the anointed ruler must be from an unending line of kings in Psalm 45, these ancient ideas were not only of great importance for early Christians, they were the foundation upon which their messianic story was built. The authors themselves even admit to this, as their primary character openly states in Luke 24:44 that his story comes from Jewish scripture. Everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. In the last episode, we discussed the book of Psalms in general and then covered the lament psalms. One genre down, 6 more to go. Today we'll be covering wisdom psalms, hymns, and royal psalms. The wisdom psalms are named so because they express ideas found in books of wisdom literature, like Job and Proverbs. The purpose of the wisdom psalms is to instill a mindset of trust in God and to guide people toward an upright lifestyle. This means ignoring the worldly life and focusing on that which is truly important, a righteous lifestyle. Like other wisdom literature, the wisdom psalms make frequent use of contrasts in which the righteous are held up alongside the wicked to highlight the differences and warn of the dire consequences for choosing the wrong path. A great example of this can be seen in the very first psalm. In fact, this contrast comprises the entirety of Psalm 1. Verses 1 to 3 describes the actions and rewards of the righteous, how they meditate on God's law and avoid sinners, and how they're rewarded with prosperity. Then verses 4 to 6 describes the wicked as being driven like chaff before the wind and unable to stand in the assembly of the just, and ultimately suffering ruin. While some features and themes of wisdom literature can be found throughout the Psalms, few carry more than a couple of lines of these ideas. For our study, we'll classify the following as wisdom psalms: 1, 36, 37, 49, 73, 112, 127, 128, and 133. Life may be short, but the wisdom psalter wants you to think long-term. While he may describe your time on earth as fleeting, he doesn't believe you should be considering earthly matters. Things like wealth and suffering should be ignored in pursuit of something greater, as these inconveniences and rewards don't truly matter. The wisdom psalms tend to present 6 basic features: a responsibility for living an upright life, an address of the injustice in life or in God's actions, downplaying the value of riches, the transitory nature of life, request for intervention, and contrasting the righteous and the wicked. Unlike the lament psalms we covered in episode 74, these features don't provide a formula or structure for the wisdom psalms. In fact, these psalms rarely present a structure, and that structure won't be utilized elsewhere. Each structure of the wisdom psalms is unique to the individual piece of music. The order in which these themes appear isn't important either, nor is their inclusion. A wisdom psalm might only contain a single feature, as we saw in Psalm 1, which only contrasts the righteous and the wicked. Let's begin with the responsibility of living an upright life. This feature may be the core purpose of the wisdom psalms. It is your personal responsibility for living a good life. This idea is prominent in Zoroastrianism, and considering the approximate dating of the Book of Psalms, we shouldn't be surprised to find Persian themes in this collection of music. A divine interest in human morality wasn't always a feature of Hebrew literature. Just compare the guidelines on wisdom literature with the actions of the patriarchs, and you'll find their lives to more closely represent those of the wicked than the righteous. But here in the Persian period, a devout man will walk an upright path. The command to do so is often stated directly, as we see in Psalm 37:3. Trust in Yahweh and do good, that you may dwell in the land and live secure. Or 37:27. Turn from evil and do good, that you may be settled forever. In other instances, the idea that one should live correctly is presented as a blessing or a promise to offer strong encouragement for choosing such a life. Just see Psalm 112:1. Blessed the man who fears Yahweh, who greatly delights in his commands. Or Psalm 128:1-2. Blessed are all who fear Yahweh and walk in his ways. What your hands provide you will enjoy. You will be blessed and prosper. Whether commanding directly or providing gentle reminders, it's clear that the wisdom psalms are encouraging worshipers to follow a moral path. The next feature of the wisdom psalms is to address injustices. Sometimes these injustices involve a natural state of affairs. Other times, God is directly responsible, and these verses can appear quite accusatory. We're familiar with this concept through the book of Job, as the man constantly points out instances in which the wicked prosper while the innocent suffer, and God is clearly to blame. We first encounter this feature in Psalm 73, the trial of the just. Verses 2-5 read, But as for me, my feet had almost stumbled, my steps had nearly slipped, because I was envious of the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. For they suffer no pain, their bodies are healthy and sleek, they are free of the burdens of life, they are not afflicted like others. Here the righteous man is heavily burdened and envies the wicked for their health and ease of life. We see this again in verses 12-14, as he contrasts his life with that of the wicked and notes the injustice of their prosperity in light of his own suffering. Such then are the wicked, always carefree, increasing their wealth. Is it in vain that I have kept my heart pure, washed my hands in innocence? For I am afflicted day after day, chastised every morning. Injustice is part of the natural world, and every religion struggles to account for it, as we noted in the episodes concerning Job. The method here is not to deny that such injustice exists, but to acknowledge it and claim that the injustice is only temporary. Just a few verses after the injustice is presented, we find the ultimate result in verses 18-20. You set them, indeed, on a slippery road. You hurl them down to ruin. How suddenly they are devastated, utterly undone by disaster. They are like a dream after waking, dismissed like shadows when you arise. Ultimately, the wicked will receive their justice and be punished accordingly. One just has to have patience. Because the wicked sometimes prosper while the innocent suffer, one must devalue wealth in order to sell this theology, which leads us to the next feature of the Wisdom Psalm. We see it first in Psalm 49:7-9. Of those who trust in their wealth and boast of their abundant riches, no man can ransom even a brother, or pay to God his own ransom. The redemption of his soul is costly, and he will pass away forever. And we find it again in verses 17-18. Do not fear when a man becomes rich, when the wealth of his house grows great. In his death he will not take along anything, his glory will not go down after him. Wealth is meaningless as it doesn't survive one's death. This is a stark contrast to earlier Jewish theology, in which the righteous were treated to great wealth and prosperity as a reward, such as Abraham when he departed Egypt with cartloads of fine fabric, gold and slaves, or when the Israelites were given the entire land of Canaan and all of the wealth and livestock that it held. We must also consider the broader theological implication here. As we've already seen in Job, there was a desire for a segregated afterlife in order to differentiate the righteous from the wicked. Without that, the only difference between their existence occurred during their lifetimes, and that drastically favored the wicked. We can see here that this theology only works if there is some later reward for the righteous. While they still lack the ideas of a paradise and punishment, they're certainly moving closer to that development. Of course, the meaninglessness of wealth is linked with the transitory nature of life, which happens to be our next feature of the Wisdom Psalm. What better way to encourage someone to ignore their current situation and chase something beyond their life than to highlight life's transitory nature? It's a bit of a nihilistic view, but in the absence of a segregated afterlife and the promise of eternal bliss, it's all they have. It first appears in Psalm 49, beginning with verse 10, coming right on the heels of our first pronouncement of the worthlessness of riches. Will he live on forever, then, and never see Sheol? Indeed, he will see that the wise die, and the fool will perish together with the senseless, and they leave all their wealth to others. Their tombs are their homes forever, their dwellings through all generations. And again in the concluding verses of that psalm. During his life his soul uttered blessings. They will praise you, for you do well for others. But he will join the company of his fathers, never again to see the light. In his prime man does not understand. He is like the beast. They perish. Even work is meaningless, as we find in Psalm 127, 1-2. Unless Yahweh builds the house, they labor in vain. Unless Yahweh guards the city, in vain does the guard keep watch. It is vain for you to rise early and put off your rest at night, to eat bread earned by hard toil. Occasionally in the Wisdom Psalms, the situation is too dire to simply press onward, and this is where we find our next feature, the request for intervention. As we saw in the Lament Psalms of the last episode, our singers sometimes need aid from God, and it's presented here in the Wisdom Psalms in much the same way. Sometimes the request includes an argument informing God why they deserve such intervention, as we see in Psalm 36:11. Show mercy on those who know you, your just defense to the upright of heart. They're stand-up citizens, so personal assistance from God would be the just thing to do. As with the Lament Psalms, this request for aid can also appear as a desire to see the wicked punished, as we find just a few verses later in chapter 36, verse 13. There make the evildoers fall, thrust them down, unable to rise. Finally, we have the most prominent feature of the Wisdom Psalms, which appears in nearly every psalm in this category, the contrast between the righteous and the wicked. This feature will be fleshed out ad nauseum in the book of Proverbs, which is comprised of about 1,000,000 such contrasts, though in all honesty, you only need about 2 or 3 to get the point. Good people do good deeds and live happier lives, and wicked people are dirtbags and die miserably. And just like that, we've covered the book of Proverbs. The contrast is so prominent because of its importance to wisdom theology. Proper fear of God and behavior ultimately leads to a noticeable difference between the righteous and their heathen counterparts. These examples provide the motivation for the general populace to follow the prescriptions set down by their priests and local leaders, and to keep their homes in order, treat their family and customers better, and make their neighborhoods safer. The entirety of Psalm 1 is an example of such a contrast, and it illustrates the formula quite well. The first 3 verses outline the behavior of the righteous, concluding with the reward they can expect from such behavior. while the final 3 verses do the same for the wicked, complete with a vague description of their punishment. It's a classic example of using both the carrot and the stick. Let's take a look at Psalm 37:21-22. The wicked one borrows, but does not repay. The righteous one is generous and gives. For those blessed by Yahweh will inherit the earth, but those accursed will be cut off. Or verses 38-39. Sinners will be destroyed altogether. The future of the wicked will be cut off. The salvation of the righteous is from Yahweh, their refuge in a time of distress. Or Psalm 73:26-27. Though my flesh and my heart fail, God is the rock of my heart. My portion is forever. But those who are far from you perish. You destroy those unfaithful to you. These contrasts are filled with warnings against wicked actions and promises rewards for those who maintain an upright life, as we see in Psalm 27:18. Yahweh knows the days of the blameless. Their heritage lasts forever. The next genre of psalms are the hymns. The primary function of the hymn was to offer praise to Yahweh. While most of the psalms offer praise to God, the hymns are distinct in that praise is their specific purpose. Most psalms don't give much in the way of details when offering praise, avoiding specifics when praising God. Not so in the hymns. These songs detail the reasons for praising God, giving descriptive praise. God's activity in the world is assured, unlike the lament psalms when they ask for God's intervention and hope that He will eventually act. God is not only worthy of song and worship. The psalmist has written a detailed explanation of why God is worthy and how He has already intervened in history. God plays an active role in the nation's history, provides for His followers, and protects the people of Israel. Reminding the worshippers of this idea and describing their reasons for praising God are the purposes behind the hymns. By our classification, there are 23 hymns in the book of Psalms. They are 8, 19, 29, 33, 65 through 68, 96, 98, 100, 103 to 105, 113, 114, 117, 135, and 146 to 150. Our first feature of the hymn psalms is praise. Not the specific and descriptive praise that is characteristic of this genre of psalm, but a call to praise. An invitation for those hearing or singing the song to step forward and engage in giving praise to Yahweh. This call to praise is usually found at the beginning of the psalm and often is stated as a simple call to prayer, such as we find in Psalm 33:3. Sing to Him a new song, skillfully play with a joyous chant. And Psalm 95:1-2. Come, let us sing joyfully to Yahweh, cry out to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before Him with a song of praise, joyfully sing out our psalms. Sometimes the call to praise occurs in the middle of the psalm, as we find in Psalm 147:12. Glorify the Lord, Jerusalem. Zion, offer praise to your God. And the call to praise is also repeated in some, appearing at the beginning and returning several verses later, as we see in Psalm 100. The opening reads, Shout joyfully to Yahweh, all you lands. Serve Yahweh with gladness. Come before Him with joyful song. Then in verse 4, we return to the call to praise with, Enter His gates with thanksgiving, His courts with praise. Give thanks to Him, blessed His name. Or in Psalm 149, which includes the call to praise 3 times in its 9 short verses, in verses 1, 3, and 5. Though the one that really takes the cake is Psalm 150. It's 6 verses long, and every single one is a call to praise. You should praise God with horns, cymbals, and stringed instruments. Praise his mighty deeds with songs and dancing. Everything that breathes on earth should give praise, not only to God, but even to the great glass dome of the firmament. The next feature of the hymn is descriptive praise. As the most prominent feature, this is the most recognizable characteristic of the hymns. Descriptive praise sometimes outlines the personal involvement of God in the lives of the people, as we find in Psalm 103:6. Yahweh does righteous deeds, brings justice to all the oppressed. Or Psalm 145:14. Yahweh supports all who are falling and raises up all who are bowed. In other instances, he is involved in the history of the land, performing deeds that affect the entire nation, as we find in Psalm 33:10. Yahweh fouls the plans of nations, frustrates the designs of peoples. Or Psalm 147:14. He brings peace to our borders and satisfies you with the finest wheat. In some instances, praise for God is linked with his involvement in the creation story, as we see in Psalm 104:19. You made the moon to mark the seasons, the sun that knows the hour of its setting. Or Psalm 147:4. He numbers the stars and gives to all of them their names. And Psalm 148:5-6. For he commanded, and they were created, assigned them their station forever, set an order that will never change. Other times, it speaks of the specific qualities of God that make him deserving of praise, such as forgiveness in Psalm 103:10-12. He has not dealt with us as our sins merit, nor requited us as our wrongs deserve. For as the heavens tower over the earth, so his mercy towers over those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our sins from us. Or his magnificent appearance in Psalm 104:1-3. Yahweh, my God, you are great indeed. You are clothed with majesty and splendor, robed in light as with a cloak. You spread out the heavens like a tent, setting the beams of your chambers upon the waters. You make the clouds your chariot, traveling on the wings of the wind. He is great in glory, in deeds, in his involvement in the daily lives of his followers, and in the pivotal moments of the nation. He created Leviathan in order to have a wrestling buddy in Psalm 104:26, and he'll be praised by all, including the mountains and the hills, in Psalm 114:4. So if even the rocks are skipping like rams, then you, as a worshiper, have no excuse to still be sitting down. Just as the wisdom psalms make use of contrasts between the righteous and the wicked to illustrate the vast differences between the two groups, so too does the hymn by contrasting the greatness of God with the weakness of humanity. This feature of the hymn psalm appears in our first example of the genre, Psalm 33. Here in verses 16-18, we're treated to the folly of trusting in the greatness of worldly things instead of trusting in God. A king is not saved by a great army, nor a warrior delivered by great strength. Useless is the horse for safety. Despite its great strength, it cannot be saved. Behold, the eye of Yahweh is upon those who fear him, upon those who count his mercy. Another example appears in Psalm 103:15-17. As for man, his days are like grass. He blossoms like a flower in the field. A wind sweeps over it, and it is gone. Its place knows it no more. But Yahweh's mercy is from age to age, toward those who fear him. His salvation is for the children's children. Or Psalm 146:3-5. Put no trust in princes, in children of Adam who are powerless to save, who, breathing their last, returns to the earth. That day all his planning comes to nothing. But blessed the one whose help is the God of Jacob, whose hope is in Yahweh his God. We see in these verses the folly of relying on mere humans for assistance. Your plans will crumble to dust, just as your body will, and you'll be forgotten. Even warriors, princes, and kings cannot truly assist you. Instead, you must turn to the patron deity of your land, the God of the patriarchs, and there you will find aid. And speaking of aid, the request for such is the next feature of the hymns. We've seen this feature before in the last episode when covering the lament psalms. There, the request for aid was much more prominent as it was the driving force behind the entire genre. Entire songs were written in order to compel Yahweh to show favor to the people and save them from one calamity or another. Here in the hymns, the situation is a bit different. The request for aid is typically more vague and perfunctory. It's an add-on to the praise, a quick aside to God to show favor after all the well-deserved praise he's received. It's of so little importance in the hymns that it only appears once in the first 4 psalms of this genre, those being Psalms 33, 95, 100, and 103. The request for intervention comes as a single line in Psalm 33:22, the closing of the hymn. May your mercy, Yahweh, be upon us as we put our hope in you. This is a far cry from the detailed descriptions of assistance demanded by the lament psalms of the last episode. Our next example comes near the end of Psalm 104 and isn't much longer, 2 short sentences in verses 30 and 31. Send forth your Spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the earth. May the glory of God endure forever. May Yahweh be glad in his works. Finally, we come to the end of the hymns with one last feature, the connection with God. Later in the royal psalms, we'll see a definite connection between the King of Israel and Yahweh, but not between God and the general population. In the royal psalms, the king stands between the people and God, bridging that gap between human and divine. But here in the hymns, the connection is quite clear and explicit. Just as God is personally involved in the land, he is also linked intrinsically with his chosen people. Much of the imagery presented here in the hymns will also be used for Jesus in order to do exactly what these verses do, to link the worshipers directly with God. See Psalm 95:7. For he is our God, we are the people he shepherds, the sheep in his hands. Or Psalm 100 verse 3. Know that Yahweh is God, he made us, we belong to him. We are his people, the flock he shepherds. Or Psalm 113, 7-9. He raises the needy from the dust, lifts the poor from the ash heap, seats them with princes, the princes of the people, and gives the childless wife a home. This isn't just a national deity anymore who moves the nation. This God is coming home, is involved in the daily lives of the common people. Psalm 145:15 speaks of Yahweh giving food to poor people, and in 146:8, he gives sight to the blind. As you can see, many of the works of Jesus can be found here in this one feature of the hymns. But God isn't only here to work for the individual on such a small and personal level. He's also here to connect with the population in general, with the entire nation. He connects with the Israelites in key moments in their history, such as we find in Psalm 111:9. He sent release to his people, decreed his covenant forever. Holy and fearsome is his name. Or Psalm 114, 1-2. When Israel came forth from Egypt, the house of Jacob from an alien people, Judah became God's sanctuary, Israel became God's domain. This may be the true purpose of the hymns as a genre, to establish a link with God, not as a suffering community begging for assistance, or as a divine king, but as an individual, as a person, to feel the presence of their patron God through song and praise and worship. Many characteristic faiths today utilize this, coming together for communal prayer and worship, letting basic human psychology send an entire congregation into a state of euphoria, which is then attributed to a spiritual experience. And I think we can catch glimpses of this in the hymns by imagining hundreds of worshipers joining together in song and imagining that the vague blessings they ask for at the end will be given. Our final genre for this episode is the Royal Psalm. The Royal Psalms are often considered a subclass of liturgical psalms, which we'll cover in the next episode. Originally, these psalms were likely part of the coronation ceremonies and used to praise the divine king. Later, after the Babylonian conquest, when the monarchy had been dissolved and the land was ruled first by the Babylonians and later by the Persians, these prominent psalms became part of the general liturgical psalms used in more generalized worship. Some of the royal psalms are written in the first person, and some scholars are convinced that these were used by the king himself to represent the people and the nation. Another possibility is that the royal psalms were used in the Second Temple period to connect Zerubbabel, the new governor of Judah, who served under the Persian king, with the kings of the past, to convince the population he was a worthy replacement and substitute for the divine monarchy. By linking him with a divinely ordained mythic king, such as David, his authority would stem directly from God. So keep these possibilities in mind when we discuss the Royal Psalms, which include the following chapters: 2, 18, 20, 21, 29, 45, 47, 72, 93, 95 through 99, 101, 110, 132, and 144. It also includes Psalm 151, which is unlikely to be included in your Bible, and we'll cover that at the end of our Psalms episodes. Many of the features we find in the Royal Psalms will be familiar from previous genres, such as invocation, the call to praise, praise and thanks, God's personal involvement in the land, the promise of reward, the request for aid, and the deliverance of the reward. There's a great deal of overlap with the laments and the hymns. The first feature we'll cover is the invocation. Either the congregation or the king invokes God, summoning him to intervene on behalf of the king to lend strength or aid in time of trouble, just as we found in the laments. Here it serves an identical purpose. Just as the individual or community suffered and invoked God in order to find relief or aid, so too does the nation suffer, and the king or community invokes God in order to convince him to act. In these cases, a royal psalm can be classified as a sort of lament psalm. We find examples of this in the beginning of Psalm 20, verse 1. Yahweh, answer in time of distress. The name of the God of Jacob defend you. Or again, at the end of that psalm in verse 10. Yahweh, grant victory to the king. Answer when we call upon you. Here Yahweh is being summoned, called upon to answer the people on behalf of the king of Judah. Or see Psalm 144, 5. Yahweh, incline your heavens and come down. Touch the mountain and make them smoke. In this case, the presence of Yahweh is represented by a cloud of smoke, which we saw in previous episodes, such as those dealing with Ezra and Nehemiah in the Second Temple, and the clouds of smoke in the Holy of Holies, also in the episodes dealing with Moses on Mount Sinai, when he enters the cloud of smoke. The pervasive association with the presence of Yahweh in a cloud of smoke was assumed to be an indication that drug use was involved in the worship of Yahweh in Jewish temples. It was common for priests to use a variety of smoke-producing compounds in their worship. These would be added to braziers to produce large amounts of smoke in a small enclosed space. The resulting low oxygen atmosphere could produce a variety of effects in the priest who experienced this oxygen deprivation. Incense, frankincense, animal dung, evergreen boughs, poppy flowers, and even cannabis were used to produce this smoke. The contents of this smoke combined with oxygen deprivation could induce hallucinations. Until recently, these ideas could only be connected with Yahweh worship by the inclusion of themes in Jewish literature, such as associating the presence of smoke in the Holy of Holies with the presence of Yahweh. But that all changed with the excavation of Tel Arad in the 1960s, just over 30 miles south of Jerusalem. This site, which included a Jewish temple to Yahweh, yielded evidence that worshippers burned copious amounts of frankincense and cannabis in the temples of Yahweh as part of their worship, as evidenced by the examination of smoke residue inside the temple. So when we read about Yahweh appearing in a cloud of smoke, or being represented by a cloud of smoke, or a cloud of smoke in the temple being an indication of the presence of Yahweh, this is what the author is referring to. The next feature of the royal psalms is the call to worship. The singer encourages worshipers to join in with praise and singing, adding their own voice to the song of God. It's a common feature in praise music of all types. Let's take a look at Psalm 96, 1-3. Sing to Yahweh a new song. Sing to Yahweh all the earth. Sing to Yahweh. Bless his name. Proclaim his salvation day after day. Tell his glory among the nations, among all the peoples his marvelous deeds. Or a few verses later. Give to Yahweh, you families of nations. Give to Yahweh glory and might. Give to Yahweh the glory due his name. Bring gifts and enter his courts. Bow down to Yahweh, splendid in holiness. Tremble before him all the earth. We can see here the psalm encourages, as part of its lyrics, all the congregants, and indeed all the world, to join in praise and worship. This occurs again in Psalm 98, 4-6, when it encourages all of the earth to shout with joy and break into song and use musical instruments, or Psalm 99, 9, when it suggests you exalt Yahweh and bow down before the holy mountain where their God lives. Linked closely with the call to praise is the praise itself. Now that the congregation is engaged, they can bring singing to their God, extolling on his virtues and thanking him for his actions. This can be a natural extension of the call to worship, or it can stand alone. This sort of praise is often vague and offers thanks in a general sense, not necessarily for a specific action. See Psalm 18, 2-4. I love you, Yahweh, my strength. Yahweh, my rock, my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my rock of my refuge, my shield, my saving town, my stronghold. Praise be Yahweh, I exclaim. I have been delivered from my enemies. Or Psalm 21, 2-5. Yahweh, the King, finds joy in your power. In your victory, how great he rejoices. You have granted him his heart's desire. You did not refuse the request of his lips. For you welcomed him with good blessings. You placed on his head a crown of pure gold. He asked life of you. You gave it to him. Length of days forever. As you can see from these two examples, there's an echo of the royal psalms in the story of Jesus, who will later be considered a deliverer, a God-appointed king, and possessing of eternal life. Another example in Psalm 21:14 might bring us even closer to the later story of Jesus and reveal something long hidden about Yahweh. It reads, Arise, Yahweh, in your power. We will sing and chant the praise of your might. This detail, that Yahweh must arise in his power, could hint at his role as a dying and rising God. In the ancient Near East, many of the gods who rose to power after defeating the great primordial dragon or god of death, such as Baal or Marduk, often died in the attempt and were later resurrected. Their identity as a dying and rising god linked them with the cycle of nature and fertility of the land. They died in winter and returned to life in spring. And since these patron gods were linked with the divine king, the king's life was likewise linked with these cycles. This gave rise to such festivals as Zagmuk in Babylon, in which the king would be quote unquote killed and later resurrected. Often, these rituals featured a stripping of the king of his robes, crown, and scepter as he was disgraced, and then the high priest would return these symbols of his station as he was returned to glory and ascended once again to the throne. In some cases, to more closely link the king with the dying god, he actually was killed, though they didn't kill the real king. They placed a robe, scepter, and crown on a criminal and killed him in the king's place. Then the real king could arise and ascend the throne. And this, taking a criminal and placing a crown on his head, a scepter in his hands, and a robe on his shoulders, while degrading and mocking him before his death, brings us even closer to Jesus, especially when we remember that Yahweh, whom Jesus represented, fought Leviathan at the beginning of time and likely, according to the story, died in that endeavor, only to be roused again 3 days later, emerging from the carcass of Leviathan before ascending to heaven to take the throne, and then begin creating the world. We should remember this detail when a verse tells Yahweh to arise or proclaims that Yahweh lives. Closely related to the thanksgiving for God's actions is our next feature, God's personal involvement in the land, an expected detail when we recall that the patron deity is linked with the ruling king. Just as the king is personally involved with the fate and prosperity of the nation, so too is the deity whom that king represents. This feature is present in the majority of the royal psalms, indicating its importance. Sometimes his involvement is directed at the enemies of the king, such as in Psalm 2, 4 through 5. The one enthroned in heaven laughs, Yahweh derides them. Then he speaks to them in his anger. In his wrath he terrifies them. Or Psalm 18, 8 through 9, where Yahweh is presented with volcano imagery. The earth rocked and shook, the foundations of the mountain trembled. They shook as his wrath flared up. Smoke rose from his nostrils, a devouring fire from his mouth. It kindled coals into flames. In other instances, Yahweh is seen as a defender, lending aid to the king, as we see in Psalm 18:19. They attacked me on my day of distress, but Yahweh was my support. Or Psalm 72:6, when he acts to bring fertility to the land. May he be like rain coming down upon the fields, like showers watering the earth. Or bringing victory for Israel in Psalms 98, 2 through 3. Yahweh has made his victory known, has revealed his triumph in the sight of nations. He has remembered his mercy and faithfulness toward the house of Israel. All the ends of the earth have seen the victory of our God. He can also be involved through his link to the priesthood and as a lawgiver, as we see in Psalm 99, 6 through 7. Moses and Aaron were among his priests, Samuel among those who called on his name. They called on Yahweh, and he answered them. From the pillar of cloud he spoke to them. They kept his decrees, the law he had given. The next feature, and one of the most prominent in the royal psalms, is establishing the king as God's representative on earth. This appears early in our list of royal psalms and recurs throughout. The king of Jerusalem isn't a mere mortal, but is presented as one whose status is decreed by God, the anointed or Messiah, and even the Son of God himself. He is set above the other earthly kings by his connection with Yahweh. We see this spelled out in Psalm 2:2 when the rulers of the nations are depicted as inferior enemies. Kings on earth rise up and princes plot together against Yahweh and against his anointed one. And a few verses later, in verses 6 through 7, we discover the true nature of the king of Jerusalem. I myself have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will proclaim the decree of Yahweh. He said to me, You are my son. Today I have begotten you. The king of Judah is here connected with heaven by virtue of being the Son of God himself. This idea isn't restricted to Psalm 2. We find it again in Psalm 29:10 when we're told that Yahweh reigns as the king forever, or Psalm 45:8. You love justice and hate wrongdoing. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your fellow kings. Or in Psalm 47:7, when the king and God are spoken of synonymously. Sing praise to God, sing praise to our King, sing praise. The subsequent verses go on to detail how it is God who rules the nation and sits upon the throne. And again in Psalm 93:1, when Yahweh is said to be the king, and it is he who is described as wearing the royal robes. The next feature is another that is familiar from the lament psalms, the call for aid or intervention. We could consider these instances to be a third classification of lament alongside personal and communal laments. These instances of royal laments don't occupy the entire psalm, however, but do carry some of those common themes. In Psalm 72, 4 through 9, we find a list of requests as they ask God for intervention. Among these are the request to save the children of the poor, to crush their oppressors, for favorable weather for the crops, a bountiful harvest, for the king to rule, and for his enemies to lick the dust at their feet. Another instance comes in Psalm 144, 10 through 11. Give victory to kings. You delivered David your servant from the menacing sword. Deliver me. Rescue me from the hands of foreign foes. Their mouths speak untruth. Their right hands are raised in lying oaths. And a few verses earlier, God is asked to shoot arrows down at their enemies. God answers their prayers and responds to their praise with rewards. In some instances, this reward comes as a promise of things to come, as we find in Psalm 2:8. Ask it of me, and I will give you the nations as your inheritance, and as your possession the ends of the earth. Or Psalm 21:9. Your hand will find all your enemies, your right hand will find your foes. In other instances, the reward is already given. For example, we have Psalm 18:25. Yahweh rewarded my righteousness, the cleanness of my hand in his sight. Or Psalm 72:13. He shows pity to the needy and the poor, and saves the lives of the poor. Or Psalm 97:10. You who love Yahweh also hate evil. He protects the souls of the faithful, rescues them from the hand of the wicked. Elsewhere, the strength of God is bestowed upon the king to grant him power over his enemies, as in Psalm 18:30. With you I can rush an armed band. With my God to help, I can leap a wall. This causes rival kings of neighboring nations to cower before the kings of Judah, as we find in Psalm 45:6. Your arrows are sharp, peoples will cower at your feet, the king's enemies will lose heart. Or in Psalm 72:10. May the kings of Tarshish and the islands bring tribute, the kings of Sheba offer gifts. He also grants the king with wisdom and a sharper mind so he can rule effectively, as we see in Psalm 72:2. O God, give your judgment to the king, your justice to the king's son, that he may govern your people with justice, your oppressed with right judgment. Another link is the sharing of prosperity and long life, as we find in Psalm 72:15. Long may he live, receiving gold from Sheba, prayed for without cease, blessed day by day. Throughout the royal psalms, the king in Jerusalem is closely linked with Yahweh, the patron god of the land, who is personally responsible for great events in their history and the prosperity of the nation. His life is linked with the cycle of nature, and the strength of God is bestowed upon the king, allowing him to crush his enemies. And all of this is tied in with the concept of the Messiah, Yahweh's anointed representative on earth, who sits on the throne, which represents the throne in heaven, stationed above the firmament. And the method for praising God is through praising the divine King, because, as we know from John 14:6, no one comes to the Father except through me. Or, as it was written in the 14th century BCE, concerning the divine king Akhenaten and his connection to Aten, in what some consider to be the oldest monotheistic religion. There is no other who knows you, only your son Akhenaten. That's going to wrap it up for this episode. If you'd like to support the show, there's an Amazon wish list in a pinned post on my Facebook page. The books in that list help with research for future episodes. You can also shop merchandise from my Zazzle store, which can be found on that same post. Just visit facebook.com/dragonsofgenesis. And you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/dragonsofgenesis. If you have any questions concerning mythology in the Bible, send them to me at dragonsofgenesis.com, and I'll try to answer your question in a video on my YouTube channel over at youtube.com/dragonsofgenesis podcast. Don't forget to give a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast, and check out the site over at dragonsofgenesis.com for links, episode information, and a list of recommended reading. And as always, thank you for listening.